The average real hourly wage for non-supervisory U.S. workers, adjusted for inflation, has grown by less than $10 percent dollars over the last 4 decades, while total financial wealth has expanded by over $400 percent dollars in the same period. This is the first contradiction. The current U.S. debt-to-GDP ratio exceeds 120%, a threshold historically associated with severely constrained fiscal and monetary autonomy, yet the global demand for U.S. Treasury debt persists, suppressing interest rates below the level warranted by the fiscal trajectory. The second contradiction is structural. A political system that relies on constant expansion of both debt and money supply to defer systemic insolvency inevitably creates hyper-inequality, a necessary precursor to political rupture. Revolution is not an emotional explosion. It is the mathematical consequence of a prolonged structural inability to reconcile the production of value with its distribution. The current system is designed to accelerate this divergence. This is the financial historian, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks. The rupture is already priced into the cost of capital. To understand the 6-stage cycle of political and economic revolution, we need to start earlier. The model begins not with poverty, but with a structural dislocation between expectations and reality, termed Stage 1, the quiet accumulation of structural tension. This initial phase is characterized by sustained economic growth, often masked by the uneven distribution of its benefits. France, in the decades leading up to 1789, provides the foundational example. By the late 18th century, France was one of the wealthiest nations in Europe, but its wealth was concentrated in the nobility and the burgeoning financial elite, while the productive Third Estate bore nearly the entire tax burden. The state was fiscally insolvent, primarily due to the crown's guaranteed debts, while the nation was economically vibrant. This separation of fiscal risk from economic output creates the initial tension, the shift to Stage 2. The financialization of political power is critical. The state, unable or unwilling to tax the wealthy elite who fund it, resorts to debt. This debt is often securitized and held by the very class that is exempt from the productive burden. Louis XVI's reliance on figures like Jacques Necker to finance the American Revolutionary War through sovereign borrowing created a class of financial creditors who had a vested structural interest in maintaining the crown's fiscal, though not political, stability. This meant that the state's primary obligation became the service of its financial claims, not the welfare of its populace. The system is designed to protect the collateral, not the citizen. The English Civil War, 1642 to 1651, provides another lens. King Charles I's attempts to raise revenue outside Parliament through mechanisms like ship money were met with fierce resistance, not because the levies were financially crippling to the average person, but because they bypassed the institutional framework of consent. This was not a revolt against poverty. It was a revolt against the concentration of fiscal power. This was the real shift. The financial system became the source of political legitimacy, replacing traditional institutions. Confidence became currency. The numbers told a different story. In the lead-up to the 1640s, the Crown's reliance on non-parliamentary revenue streams escalated the power asymmetry. Stage 3 is called the erosion of institutional trust. As the state increasingly uses its mechanisms, the central bank, the treasury, the courts, to service the financial elite and defer the costs onto the productive class, the average citizen withdraws their consent. The Weimar Republic in the early 1920s demonstrated this acutely. The hyperinflation of 1923, which saw the mark's value plummet to $4.2 trillion per US dollar, was not merely an economic event. It was a deliberate political policy to resolve sovereign debt by destroying the wealth of the middle and working classes. This policy structurally invalidated savings, insurance, and long-term contracts. The consequence was a total and irreparable loss of faith in the institutions, the central bank, the government, the legal system, that permitted this financial violence. The state lost its monopoly on economic truth. The numbers are clear. In 1913, the German state debt was relatively manageable, but the political decision to fund World War I through domestic borrowing rather than taxation set the stage. By 1923, the total destruction of the mark's purchasing power served as a default on $154 billion gold marks of war debt, effectively clearing the ledger at the cost of the citizenry's economic future. This financial cleansing led directly to Stage 4, the manifestation of elite fragmentation and ideological extremism. The loss of institutional center forces political debate to the extremes. The French Revolution saw the internal collapse of the monarchy and nobility into competing factions. Royalists, Girondins, Jacobins, each vying to seize the central fiscal authority. The system can no longer cohere around a single economic narrative. The battlefield became the balance sheet. This fragmentation is not just political. It is driven by the realization that the resources are scarce and the game is zero-sum. The progression to stage 5, the failure of the coercive apparatus, occurs when the state can no longer reliably use its tools, the military, the police, the administrative bureaucracy, to enforce its increasingly fragile economic mandate. This failure is often budgetary. The state can no longer afford to pay the instruments of its own control. Imperial Russia's February Revolution of 1917 was triggered when the military, disillusioned by the war's financial and human costs, refused to fire on the demonstrating workers in Petrograd. The state's financial insolvency and the hyperinflation that crippled soldiers' wages translated directly into a loss of loyalty. The final stage, stage 6, the systemic reset and repudiation, is the formal collapse, leading to a new political and financial settlement, often after significant violence. The transition to the modern mechanics reveals that the U.S. is deeply entrenched in stage 4, elite fragmentation, but exhibiting the fiscal vulnerabilities of stage 5, failure of coercive apparatus. Which is the current danger? The U.S. is currently operating on stage 2 dynamics, the financialization of political power, at an unprecedented scale. The $34 trillion national debt is a debt held structurally by the financial elite, both domestic and global. The continuous refinancing of this debt requires perpetual access to cheap liquidity, which is managed by this Federal Reserve, an institution functionally independent of immediate political control, but ultimately accountable to the financial markets. This structure ensures that both major political parties are structurally compelled to prioritize market stability over fiscal sustainability. This is not a choice. It is a point about liquidity dependency. The average monthly Treasury issuance now regularly exceeds $500 billion. The shift to stage 4 is evident in the profound power-stir institutional polarization, and the inability of the elite to agree on a shared financial reality. The two political parties disagree fundamentally on the nature of the fiscal problem, taxation versus spending, and its solution, demonstrating a severe fragmentation. This is not mere political squabbling. It is a conflict between factions who hold fundamentally different views on which class should bear the cost of the $34 trillion debt. One faction prefers inflationary cleansing, stage 3, and the other prefers austerity, fiscal constraint. Since neither can gain total control, the system defaults to the politically easiest path, continuous debt issuance, which accelerates the move toward stage 5. Consider the U.S. military budget, a key component of the state's coercive apparatus. In 2024, the defense budget exceeded $886 billion. While this number is substantial, the true vulnerability lies in the $1.4 trillion its projected annual interest cost on the national debt by 2033. This interest payment will soon surpass the entire defense budget. This is the Bauer's rollover risk, translating directly into a degradation of state capacity. Every dollar dedicated to servicing past debt is a dollar diverted from future defense, infrastructure, or social stability. The state's ability to fund its coercive and administrative functions is being mathematically eroded by its own financial obligations. The recent crisis in confidence around global U.S. debt holders, specifically major foreign central banks, is a stage 4 symptom. China and other nations have incrementally reduced their holdings of U.S. treasuries, not in a punitive measure, but as a recognition of the increasing fiscal risk. This reduction forces the U.S. to rely more heavily on domestic holders and the Federal Reserve, accelerating the internal financialization, stage 2, and increasing the structural need for inflationary debasement, stage 3. The illusion holds until it doesn't. The only reason the U.S. has not fully collapsed into stage 5 is the dollar's role as the global reserve currency. This status mandates that foreign central banks and global trade remain structurally dependent on the dollar for settlement, generating artificial demand for treasury debt. However, this is a confidence loop, not a fundamental economic guarantee. Should a geopolitical or economic shock trigger a collective desire for a decentralized or non-U.S. currency settlement system, the artificial demand for treasuries would evaporate, resulting in an immediate stage 5 liquidity crisis and a sharp punitive rise in borrowing costs. Confidence decides who survives. The fragmentation of the elite ensures that no preemptive, politically costly fiscal stabilization measures will be taken. What cannot be repaid will be rolled over until the cost of the rollover itself becomes prohibitive. The final analytical focus on stage 4 and its potential transition to stage 5 requires a clinical examination of the U.S. social and economic fissures. The current environment is characterized by accelerated asset inflation and persistent wage suppression. This dynamic creates the necessary socioeconomic conditions for revolutionary rupture. From 2007 to 2023, the net worth of the top 1% dollars of U.S. households grew by over $100 percent dollars, while the bottom 50 percent dollar saw marginal inflation eroded gains. The median home price increased by over $70 percent dollars in the same period, far exceeding median wage growth. This is the system's design manifesting as political instability. The Federal Reserve's response to crises is always via liquidity injection, which directly inflates asset prices, stocks, real estate, and disproportionately benefits the asset-owning elite, stage 2. The productive class is forced to service higher costs of living, shelter, education, healthcare, without commensurate wage increases. This creates a deeply rooted and mathematically justified sense of injustice. The system is no longer perceived as fair mediation, but as an explicit extraction mechanism. The political fragmentation of stage 4 is increasingly utilizing economic inequality as its primary fuel. The rise of extreme political narratives, both populist and socialist, is a direct function of the financial system's failure to distribute value. The rhetoric is political, but the underlying stress is purely economic. The inability of the majority to achieve solvency through traditional labor. Markets enforce what politics avoids. When the majority of the population feels structurally excluded from the benefits of the economy, the political contract is invalidated. The danger of stage 5, the failure of the coercive apparatus, is not merely the inability to pay soldiers' salaries, but the intellectual and technological failure to manage the system. The U.S. has seen repeated near defaults on the national debt due to political dysfunction, the debt ceiling crises. While these events were resolved, they were rehearsals for a catastrophic failure. A stage 5 scenario does not require a foreign power to attack. It only requires a sustained political inability to pass a budget or raise the debt limit. This administrative failure immediately triggers a liquidity crisis, forcing the Treasury to prioritize payments. If the Treasury prioritizes bondholders over Social Security recipients, the political contract ruptures. If it prioritizes domestic spending over bondholders, the global financial contract ruptures. Either choice leads to stage 6. Consider the structural risk presented by the reliance on technology for systemic stability. The speed of modern high-frequency trading and the complexity of derivatives mean that a financial panic can cascade in hours, not weeks. The state's ability to intervene is predicated on its ability to command confidence and maintain liquidity. A sudden drop in confidence, a flight from the dollar, or a major sovereign downgrade could trigger a crisis faster than the slow, bureaucratic process of political agreement. The system is inherently fragile because its stability is based on a tie, confidence loop that is now subject to the highly fragmented political will of a fractured elite. The final devastating point is that the financial system is now designed to perpetuate stage 4 instability. The high frequency of political crises, debt ceilings, shutdowns, creates volatility, which is a key source of trading profit for the largest financial institutions. Volatility is monetized. The elite profit from the very instability that drives the populace to revolution. The incentive is not to solve the fragmentation, but to manage it for maximum financial extraction. The path to stage 6 is clear. A political deadlock over a debt ceiling is maintained just long enough to trigger a technical default, forcing the hand of the Federal Reserve into a massive, unavoidable inflationary purge. The rupture is scheduled by the numbers. The U.S. is not approaching the final stage of the cycle. It is actively operating within the self-reinforcing dynamics of stage 4. The math demands a resolution. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.